I want to tell you about the effect of the NHS white paper will have on our NHS. So the first thing I want to do is to show you where our NHS money is spent at the moment. So these figures here are representative figures. They're taken from a real NHS primary care trust. So as you can see, half of the money is spent on hospitals, acute care. 9% is spent on GPs, 10% on prescriptions, 5% is spent on things like dentists, opticians and pharmacies, 10% on mental health, 15% on community services like district nurses and also continuing care. And finally at the bottom, 3% is spent on management. Now management is actually commissioning. These are the people who look at the providers in your area, look at the money that's provided and determine who is going to provide which services. That is commissioning. Now some NHS services are actually provided by private providers. GPs, for example, are private businesses. And also, of course, dentists, opticians and pharmacies are also private businesses. Under the government's proposals, GPs will be given control of 80% of this budget. Now, most GPs will not want to do commissioning. They do not want to do management of this money. So instead, they'll buy in this service from the private sector. And this, of course, will represent the privatisation of commissioning. But the government also wants to create what they call the largest social enterprise sector in the world. And they want to do this out of the NHS. A social enterprise is a private business. It is not for profit, but it is still a private business. It is no longer publicly owned. It is no longer publicly run. The public will have no say at all in how a social enterprise is run. And that means that hospitals will be taken out of public ownership. It also means that community services, continuing care and mental health services will also be taken out of public ownership and handed over to private businesses. The government wants to abolish NHS trusts, and so social enterprises will be the only option for most NHS providers. And so this plan will mean that none of the NHS will be publicly owned. But the government also wants the private sector to provide more services for the NHS. So what will this mean when most of the NHS providers will be social enterprises? Well, over time, the private sector will provide more and more services for social enterprises. And in some cases, they will take over social enterprises. So, of course, this will mean that these social enterprises will be taken over by the private sector. And the result, well, it'll mean that there will be no publicly owned and no publicly run services. All NHS services will be run by a private business of one kind or another. Some of these services will be social enterprises, but there will still be private businesses. Some of the services will be provided by the private sector, for profit. So this represents the privatisation of our NHS. And remember, it is our NHS.